What on earth is going on back in the UK? As you know, I'm in China at the moment, but I do like to stay on top of the news and what's going on. So the last few stories that have caught my eye in the last couple of days, to be perfectly honest, appear a little bit ridiculous. So we have a transgender pair of competitors in the final of a women's competition. So two biological males identifying as female in the final of a women's competition. More about that in a minute. Freedom of information requests confirmed that many police forces are conducting over 12,000 arrests a year, according to the data from 2023, which is more than 30 a day. More about that in a minute. And a nurse who's been investigated and then suspended because she called a transgender PDF file patient Mr., even though she said that it was against her faith and beliefs, and she was administering care, which was particular to male biology. So more about that in a minute. And even as I'm saying it, it sounds ridiculous, but let's talk about it, because these are actually fairly serious issues. They do pertain to law, and we do need to know where we stand on them. So just a bit of an overview here. My perspective. Traveling changes your perspective somewhat. So as I said, I'm in China. Much more about that later in other videos. I'm planning on doing a long vlog about it, my experiences here. I haven't been here for many years. I have been here many, many times in the past for extensive periods, but not for a while. And all I can say is they have their stuff sorted here. Absolutely sorted out. It feels like I've gone forward in time. It feels 10, 15, if not 20 years in the future with the way that they're handling things here. More about that in other videos. But also we've been catching up with friends and family and discussing what happens in each country and how things are handled. And obviously we discussed some of these stories. Now, I mean no disrespect to anybody here watching and anybody that might be affected by any of these stories. However, can you imagine how ridiculous it sounds to someone living in a country with 1.8 billion people, and they have everything so well organized and in line and without any interruptions, to explain these stories and why people are being arrested in the UK? Have you any idea how ridiculous that sounds and how difficult it is to explain that this is reality? So with that aside, let's have a look at some of these stories. So Piers Morgan was picked up for saying that this was preposterous, and he asks why anyone would support this cheating BS with regard to the biological males in a women's competition final. Now, as I said, I mean no disrespect to anybody, and people can identify however they wish. However, there is this huge divide in beliefs and thoughts as to who should be in the sporting categories, depending on how they identify. Now, to be absolutely clear, the law does say that they can be restricted to biological female and biological male categories in any kind of sport, for fairness, for safety, and all sorts of other reasons. And so I frankly support that. I support completely separate categories, leave it at that, and keep it simple. Some sports are moving down that way and some are not, as is the case in this story reported here. So as I said, Piers Morgan and others caused a bit of outrage with regard to this story just recently. So I read from China, bearing in mind I'm reading all of this from thousands of miles away, where everything is absolutely organized. And again, with the population, I mean, where I am at the moment, I'm in Chengdu at the moment. There's more than 30 million people in Chengdu alone, and everything runs smoothly and is well organized. So more about that in another video. But again, perspective really does make you look at these stories in another light altogether, if I didn't have my views about them already. Now, looking at the Freedom of Information requests revealing the amount of people being arrested for malicious communications. Now, Keir Starmer has made comments about this as well. Keir Starmer, in fact, denied that there was a problem with free speech or a free speech crisis in Britain when he was pressed by JD Vance about this at the White House, you might remember. But the data suggests that we do have a serious problem. A spokesperson for Leicester Police said that crimes under the relevant sections for malicious communications include any form of offence. So there could be phone calls, there could be letters, there could be emails, and indeed hoax calls to emergency services. Now, the usual caveat here, I don't support abusive phone calls and messages and emails and these kind of things, but there has to be a very serious threshold that this then becomes a crime. And only if and when this threshold is met and breached, these should be then investigated and prosecuted as a crime. The spokesperson said, where a malicious communications offence is believed to have taken place, appropriate action will be taken. Our staff must consider whether the communication may be an expression which could be considered freedom of speech. While it may be unacceptable to be rude or offensive, it's not unlawful unless the communication is grossly offensive. And yet, across 37 police forces that responded, there are thousands of arrests being made. And this, by the way, not including Police Scotland, who didn't reply. I suspect that might push these statistics significantly higher.
Now, just to interject with an I told you so, if you remember me talking about your data being on the NHS servers and various software, and that was at risk of being breached, well, here we are, I told you so, because an NHS software provider has been fined £3 million over a data breach. The service provider, Advanced Computer Software Group, has been fined £3 million over a ransomware breach that compromised NHS data and shut down services. The ICO has fined them just over £3 million over security lapses that led to this ransomware attack on the NHS and placed the personal data of 79,000 people at risk. And I'm surprised it is so few people. The company is just one of many software providers providing their services to the NHS across the country and holding your data. Now, holding your data is essential, but as I've mentioned in previous videos, there are ways to protect your data from other companies from getting hold of it in case they've purchased it in some way as a result of one of these leaks. And so to that end, I happily recommend to you the services of Incogni, which is a company that specializes in requiring companies to remove your data from their servers. Even if they've bought it legitimately or they think it's legitimately, they then might just start marketing to you. But if your data falls into the wrong hands, you may then end up the victim of identity theft and all sorts of other things. Incogni will use UK and US law to request and require these companies to remove your data from their servers before it falls into the wrong hands. And of course, as a partner to my channel here, I get you a discount, which is 60% off. That's 60% off using the code BlackBelt at the link in the description below. And of course, you get a 30-day money-back guarantee. But when you see the dashboard and the number of companies that confirm they have your data and they start removing your data, you'll be amazed at how many companies have this information about you. And you'll be very glad to see them removing it. So grab yourself the 60% discount using the code BlackBelt at the link in the description below. And once you see the companies removing your data, you'll be very glad you did so. So thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video and keeping you all safe.
Now, whilst I will say that there's been a downward trend in the actual sentences for these offences, around 2,000 a year back in 2010, it seems to have not quite halved, but almost halved as of the time of reading these articles. The numbers of arrests have risen significantly, particularly since the pandemic lockdown. And now this, as I've said in many videos previously, is a serious problem because there is possibly a misunderstanding. Now, of course, a lot of these arrests may be genuine, they may be serious because being grossly offensive, etc. is wrong, and I don't support anybody being offensive at all, whether it crosses the threshold or not. I obviously don't support people sending those messages, but unless it crosses a criminal threshold, it should not even be investigated. So depending on what's been reported, I am of the view that this is a waste of police time if they are making arrests, inquiries, and following these things up when actually there's no real prospect of it crossing the threshold in the first place. Particularly when, as in one of the most common reasons that these don't lead to prosecutions, is where the victim does not support the prosecution. And a second reason is where there is insufficient evidence to actually prosecute these as an offence in the first place. So given those two reasons, the victim is not interested in prosecuting and there's not sufficient evidence to prosecute, why are they even making arrests in the first place? Now, again, caveat, they often will have to make arrests to gather information and evidence upon which they may then support a prosecution. But they should be able to get some information from the initial report in order to make that decision of whether they're going to arrest in the first place. That's my view, and my view is that it's a bit of a waste of time. Now, as I've said in previous videos, I think this is a serious problem because these can lead to reports and then recordings of non-crime hate incidents, which could have a serious effect on you depending on what your profession is and what you do. And speaking of effect on professions and expressing things and being criticized, etc., that leads me very neatly onto the next story, which is about this nurse called Jennifer, who was reported because she refused to use the preferred pronouns of a biologically male patient who happened to be a PDF file. And she was asked to, I think, according to the story, I'll link below again, she was asked to sort out a catheter, which obviously very particularly pertains to male biology. And there needs to be no confusion between members of medical staff as to how to treat said patient. So in this situation, in my view, they have to be absolutely clear, regardless of what the person's independent identification. I have no issue with how someone identifies, but when it comes down to treatment and whether others are expected to adhere to their preferences, etc., that is where I draw a bit of a line, particularly with regard to the professional care. Because if they are administering particularly medical care, but any kind of care really, then it absolutely is necessary for them to be clear as to whether this is a biologically male patient or a biological female. And therefore, the treatment that they give cannot be confused in any sense. And so that is absolutely critical for me. And again, I think this is a little bit ridiculous. That is my opinion. I stand by it because I have my firm beliefs as well, as does this nurse here. And I personally believe, on top of all of that, she should not have been investigated. She certainly should not have been suspended. And as I understand it from the article, she's now filing a legal claim, which will be based on the fact that this is a protected philosophical belief. And since the Forstater case, which upheld this as a philosophical belief, that obviously stands her in very good stead. So as I say, I think these are all a little bit ridiculous, but particularly from the perspective of being here, seeing how a very, very busy city is well organized and runs very smoothly with a significantly higher population than we have back in the UK. Reading these stories with a fraction of the population of this country here is staggering. And trying to explain these stories to people here is, again, frankly, a bit bizarre. So all I can say is if you are accused of these things, you need to seek legal advice to see whether or not realistically what you've done or said has crossed that criminal threshold. Now, again, I stress, I don't condone sending each other nasty emails and nasty messages and things like that. A little spat on social media is one thing, but if somebody goes out of their way to find your email address and then email you offensive language or send it to a generic email address and things like that, where lots of people read it and it's grossly offensive, then that may well cross a threshold. That may then well be worth investigating. But even then, there is a degree of offense that until it becomes grossly offensive, oppressive, unacceptable, then this is just exercise of free speech. So even if somebody is offended by it, even if it is intended to be offensive, that is not itself an offence. Even the police had to apologise for that at one point. They drove a banner around and said being offensive is an offence, which of course it's not. It's simply not an offence itself per se to be offensive. So I would say avail yourself of legal advice. Don't just immediately admit to what you're being accused of, because these things can have serious repercussions further down the line. They can even be prosecuted as a hate crime if it's motivated out of a certain sense of a protected characteristic element, and if you've admitted to it, that can become a hate crime. That can have serious consequences further down the line. And going back to the riots and the prosecutions that came out of those, and therefore lots of people went to prison because they pleaded guilty. They went to prison very quickly because they pleaded guilty, and that's why they were turned around so quickly. I personally feel that many of those prosecuted may well have been found not guilty had they pleaded not guilty. And so that is always something to bear in mind. This video is not intended to be legal advice. You are always encouraged to seek your own independent legal advice, but I hope that is some food for thought. So thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing my thoughts on these stories. I'll tell you much more about where I am and what I'm doing and my experience here in another video, probably on Black Belt Secrets. I'll link below. Wait for the big vlog to come out. I'm putting lots of little snippets together you might find interesting. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.